The PlayStation ports made by Nixxes got updates, FSR 3.1 plus frame generation that is independent from it. So we got Ghost of Tsushima, Horizon Forbidden West, Miles Morales, and Spider-Man Remastered, and Ratchet and Clank ripped apart. So we're going to revisit them, show you my optimized settings when it comes to if frame generation is worth it or not. What about FSR 3.1? Does it look any good? Let's get into it right away. Alright, so we start with Spider-Man Remastered. This one, again, FSR 3, quality. Personally, I'll tell you what I'm talking about in a second. Graphics, medium textures, low shadows, level of detail low. I'll explain why once I enable frame generation. But the game still looks pretty damn good in my opinion. Let me increase the sharpness. Yeah, it's a little bit too much. To 5. So this is with FSR 3 on quality. I have allowed tearing and I disable the frame rate limit. And let me show you everything. So this is with FSR 3. When looking into the distance, we drop into the 30s. Classic CPU limitation on this one. But you'll see, I said multiple times, FSR 2, when it was the main thing in this game, looked pretty chunky on the pixels. This is no different. I tried lowering the sharpness, I tried multiple things, but the game still doesn't look particularly great with FSR 3. I think it's just an iterative thing, but now we got also frame generation. Personally, I'll use XeSS on this one. I think it looks better. So this is the frame rate. Let's now enable frame generation. Now we can enable it here. Press R2. And you'll see something super interesting. First of all, the frame times are horrible. The game feels laggy AF. We get drops everywhere. And I was banging my head against the wall because I was looking at a couple of videos of people playing this and the frame times were fine. Well, as you can probably notice, the GPU clock is at 500 MHz, should be at 1000 or closer. 2 of the CPU cores have been maxed out. So how do we improve this situation with frame gen? Well, pretty simple. 3 dots, scroll all the way down to manual GPU clock and put it at 1200 MHz, so we force the GPU to not drop the core clock. So we starve the CPU of power a little bit. And look, it's fixed. So if you're planning on using frame generation, please, for the love of God, lock the GPU clock to 1200 MHz. That fixed the game for me. Doesn't feel particularly great because we're above the refresh rate of the screen. But let's lock it to 60 using the in-game VSync. So we pause the game, settings, display and graphics. In display, where it says VSync, enable it, press R2. Make sure that in your menu allow tearing is on and frame limit is on as well to disable it. And now with the in-game VSync and frame generation, yeah, you get more latency with the controls and all that, but the game actually appears smoother. So yeah, there's more latency to the controls, which is understandable. We're generating fake frames. There's some ghosting here and there, but it works. I mean, I'll show you some slow motion footage when Spider-Man is running up a building to show you, well, the shadow there, you could see it. That there is ghosting, especially in situations like this. I wouldn't say it's unplayable. On the smaller screen, it looks way better. So I'm going to show that super quickly. So 1 sec. Come back, same settings as before. Lock to 1200 MHz on the GPU. Frame generation, quality FSR 3. Let me lower the brightness a bit so you can see what's going on without being too bright. Let's go. And honestly, I mean, while you can see the chunky pixels of FSR 3, is way better than on the direct capture, obviously, because it's a 7-inch screen. So you have to look pretty closely to notice that, at least in my opinion. So what I would do to sum up Spider-Man, just use XeSS. So XeSS on quality or balanced. In my opinion, looks significantly better with XeSS. I think they also updated XeSS to 1.3. I'll check the patch notes for that once again. But it feels good. A little bit more latency, obviously, because we're generating fake frames. And the frame times are a little bit weird. But the game itself looks pretty smooth. The thing is, again, those controls have a bit of latency. So up to you. And if you want to do it like before, just disable frame generation, keep it on quality XeSS, you should be closer to the 40s, and it should be a good experience, with the best latency out there. For Spider-Man Miles Morales, similar settings to Spider-Man Remastered, FSR 3 quality, graphics basically like this, level of detail low to help that CPU when we're moving very fast. So this is first without frame generation. Enable this, disable frame limit, allow tearing. So as you can see, we have a pretty decent frame rate, about 30 at all times. Some stutters here and there, especially when swinging quickly, so it drops into the 30s. A bit more demanding than the previous Spider-Man game. For Frame Gen, we enable it. And once we enable Frame Gen, let's see what happens. Let's see if we stay into the 60s. As you can see, analog frame rates, kind of unnecessary in my opinion. Just stick to 60 Hz. But it still feels a bit choppy. So we're going to do the following. Alright, so handheld, XeSS, quality, disable frame limit, allow tearing, GPU clock at 1200, and VSync on from the game's options menu. And there you go. Frame generated Miles Morales. Is it perfect? No, you can feel the extra latency. There is some ghosting while running up walls as an example, or your shadow going pretty quickly around buildings. But again, if you want the perception of 6 FPS, you have it. The responsiveness feels more like the 40s, I would say. Frame times are not perfect. I'd rather try and achieve 40s without frame generation. And lower settings didn't change my experience so much. But there you go. For Horizon Forbidden West, that it's incompatible because performance, we're playing at 800p. Performance XeSS, but let's do FSR 3 first so you can see the nightmare that it is. Graphics on the very low preset, but I'm going to do some changes in a moment. As you can probably notice, it's a blocky mess with FSR 3 on performance. I mean, it's 50% 800p, it's 400p, and the game looks much worse. But hey, we're over 30. Nowhere close to perfect, but what can you do? So, settings, display, frame generation, FSR 3. You don't need to be using FSR to enable Frame Gen FSR 3. And we run into very similar issues like on Spider-Man. First of all, since we're playing at 30-ish FPS with drops into the 20s, there is a huge amount of latency when I move the camera. I'm going to show you that in a moment. And we have the same GPU frequency issues. So first order of business, allow tearing, disable frame limit, manual GPU clock at 1200, something like that. Then go into settings, display, VSync on. And you have something like this. Feels a lot better to control, but still, due to the base frame rate being so low, even at the lowest settings, the game still doesn't feel right. And the frame times are significantly worse. Let me show you this in handheld so you can get a better idea on what's going on. We're now in handheld, and as you'll see when I move the thumbstick, it takes forever for the controls to respond. Frame times are horrible. Yeah, this doesn't make the game playable in my opinion. It feels choppy as hell. I don't know, and it looks bad, let's be honest here, considering what the game can do. So without frame gen, you're into the 30s. With frame gen, you are into the 40s, but with very high latency to the controls. Let's go to the absolute lowest to prove my point. Lowest settings, performance XeSS, so 400p. Again, without frame gen, mid 30s. With frame gen, it jumps into the 40s, 50s, or 60s. In my opinion, the game still looks way worse than it could. Let me check if it applied my settings actually. Yeah, it's on very low. And I say the game looks bad in comparison to what it can be achieved by this game. We still have shadows, we still have pretty small details. And now with frame generation, it actually feels better than before on very low. But again, how to say this? The input lag is insane. It doesn't make sense to play with frame gen. Despite the number looking nice and all, the frame times are bad. It just doesn't feel right. Too much latency with the controls, despite the FPS number looking pretty good. So this game is just not... the Steam Deck is not good enough for this game. Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, 800p, VSync on, and I, in this menu, as before, allow tearing and disable the frame limit, so the game takes care of VSync. FSR 3, let's start with quality on this one. Then on the graphics, this is what we got. So this should be good enough to be above 30, basically, and close to 40. So here we go. And the game looks pretty damn good, in my opinion. Although, again, as I said before, FSR 3, I don't like the look of it. It looks too chunky, like I said on the Spider-Man games. Yeah, while this works pretty well, I mean, a mix of visuals and performance, I'll still use XeSS on this one. In my opinion, the edges are treated better, to say it in some way. But we got frame generation with... that is basically separate from using FSR, so you can use balanced XeSS. That looks pretty good in my opinion. Frame generation, before enabling frame generation, let's apply this change. So we were into the 40s, now 42, a couple extra frames. Frame generation enabled. And let's put the entire performance overlay. And with frame gen, we're hitting 60s. And actually, on this one, it feels better than in Horizon, because we have a higher base frame rate. But I think this is still not good enough. Doesn't feel... I mean, visually, it looks like 60. It's pretty consistent. But I'm seeing... yeah, I mean, the input lag is very, very noticeable. Let me unlock the frame rate super quick, so you guys can see what's going on. Okay, so that should give us more consistency, but again, on this one also the input lag is very, very noticeable, at least for me. Fighting and all that, it can drop into the upper 30s. So yeah, my advice is that you ignore it on this one, just use XeSS balanced, a mix between medium and low, and you should be good to go. FSR frame generation is there. This time performance XeSS with VSync on. And as you can probably notice, when I move the stick, the latency is very noticeable. Even if I unlock the frame rate, it responds almost immediately in comparison. So I'd rather lock it to 40 and try to stay there than using frame gen on this one. Feels way better to play, less choppy. And the latency, I mean, especially since in this game you have to aim your gun and do a lot of that precision. I don't know, it just doesn't feel right. I would avoid it personally. Yeah. It's hard to aim with this one. It just feels like I was playing a game that is being streamed over a slow network, to say it in some way. And finally, Ghost of Tsushima. This one already had frame generation, but they updated FSR to 3.1, 800p, VSync on, make sure that you disable frame limit, allow tearing, let the game do the VSync, in my opinion at least. FSR 3 balanced, dynamic resolution disabled, and frame generation for now is disabled as well. When it comes to graphics, it's basically a mix, it's the medium preset with low shadows and low volumetrics, because for frame gen you need a good base frame rate. And here we are, welcome to Ghost of Tsushima. And one issue that I had with FSR since the game came out is when you move the camera, the pixels are super chunky. Not sure if you can notice that, but I'm going to zoom in. So when I'm moving around it's fine. I move the camera and all the trees, transparencies get blocky as hell. So FSR 3 doesn't look amazing. 3.1 even, in my opinion. But you're here for frame generation, so I'll give you what you want. Again, the frame times, as before, are all over the place. Feels pretty choppy and looks pretty choppy. Just look at this camera motion. So, like on the other games, scroll all the way down, manual GPU clock, make sure it's at least at 1200 MHz. And let's see if this gives us any improvements. Okay, now we have frame generated 50s. It feels better than before, but I'm feeling that, how to say it, that input lag is real. At least in my opinion, the input lag is very noticeable. This game requires to parry, to block. So do things that usually require timing. So the added latency I think is not worth it, in my opinion. Also, FSR 3 doesn't look particularly great here. It looks more clear and sharp than XeSS. XeSS on this one is a bit too soft, in my opinion. With FSR 3, when I move the camera, it just looks like a choppy mess. A blocky mess. I'll show you some slow motion stuff right now. The enemies move their shields. Don't get me wrong, it's still impressive that we can do this on deck. But in this case, I'll use XeSS once more. So XeSS balanced, maybe even on performance. So give it a few secs. So XeSS looks softer and I chose a lower resolution, but still the frame generation keeps my input lag pretty high, I would say. Again, even with VSync disabled completely, I don't know, it just feels very choppy. Again, I think it's probably because of the base frame rate being so low. But in a game like this that requires timing, I'd rather play without frame generation. Just personal preference. And yeah, it's not amazing. I mean, I can still feel the latency there. On the smart screen, the resolution drop is less noticeable. Just the input lag is too high, in my opinion. XeSS looks pretty good though. I think you should choose it over FSR 3 on this one. So let me show you now how it looks like without a frame generation. So same settings, but no frame generation. So the game, of course, will look choppier because it's a lower choppier. Yeah, to the eyes, it looks more choppy because it's a lower frame rate, obviously. But it controls, I mean, the latency from moving the camera is so much better. And there's no, how to say it, I don't know, it just doesn't feel awkward to move the camera and attack. I can actually time my attacks better. All the Nix's games that I've been playing, for some reason, if you're doing frame generation, the GPU clock drops like crazy and the game becomes kind of unplayable. So you have to manually lock the GPU clock to 1200, which, I mean, I was banging my head against the wall to make that work, and I found it, luckily. So would I recommend enabling frame generation for the Steam Deck LCD? Well, on Marvel Spider-Man Remastered and Miles Morales, I think it's a great addition. It actually feels consistent when you're playing it. If you don't mind the extra input latency, I think is a good thing. Then when it comes to Ratchet and Clank, that you have to do a lot of precise aiming, I don't think it's good enough, honestly. We don't have a good base frame rate to justify it, in my opinion. Horizon Forbidden West is marked as unsupported due to performance because we drop into the 20s and we stay in the low 30s. At times it's pretty inconsistent. Well, frame generation at such a low base frame rate feels horrible. I mean, you move the stick and it takes forever to to the camera to respond on the buttons, so on that one I wouldn't recommend it, at least on the LCD deck. And then when it comes to Ghost of Tsushima, I really wouldn't use it either. That game requires very precise timing, and with the extra latency that you get, the base frame rate again, sometimes it's the 40s, mid-30s on the LCD deck. I wouldn't really use it because, again, it requires it has pretty tight pairing timings. At least most of the game it's like that. So I think for the Spider-Man games, it's worth it if you don't care about the extra latency. I think it's fine, personally. Especially me, that I'm very sensitive to those changes. I've been doing this for years, looking at different frame rates across the board. And again, I would say on the Spider-Man games, it's fine. The base frame rate is pretty solid, so you can use frame generation with VSync, and it looks pretty smooth. And then on the other ones, the other three ones, Ratchet and Clank, Horizon Forbidden West, and Ghost of Tsushima, I will just ignore it and play it at 30 to 40 FPS. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope you found it helpful. If you want me to do more testing when it comes to frame gen and all that, I'll be still doing it for the OLED Steam Deck that is a bit more powerful, and on the ROG Ally because it has a VRR screen. So thank you for watching, and I'll see ya next time. Bye guys!